Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be with you here, not only in beautiful Udaipur because it's so beautiful, but also because it gives me a little break from the slugfest and the foreign policy by Twitter sphere that's going on in the US. Your politics here are so much more sedate by comparison at the moment. I know you're not used to hearing someone say that from the US, but I think it's really true. I've been asked to speak today about India's unique position in the global risk landscape and whether India is isolated or exposed. And I would suggest to you it's very much exposed. We'll talk about that in the next few minutes. But I want to shape the conversation today by first of all introducing the concept of global risk agility. The idea that we're living in a world with very unconventional problems that cannot be solved by conventional solutions. So we all need to turn the pyramid upside down and think about things in a whole new way. That's part of what I'm going to talk about now. But let's take a gander at where we are. Look at the last 4.5 billion years, and you see at the bottom right, we're there in what's called the Anthropocene era. This is the era where man-made risk collides with natural risk. And as a result of that, we are experiencing some profound changes that we have never experienced before. Consider urban migration, of course, the nuclear age, natural resource extraction, and the impact that weather has on us all. But it is having such a profound effect on us now because we're in a very transformational and disruptive phase in the world. Probably more transformational than since the industrial age was born. Technology, weather, politics, economics, everything is intertwined, and they're having a really unpredictable and profound effect. Think about these collisions vis-a-vis these following examples, the collision between man-made and natural risk. A couple of years ago in Canada, a lightning strike ended up causing fire in Fort McMurray that resulted in 25% of Canada's oil exports being shut down. Never before had that happened. The terrible crisis in Venezuela right now, people are doing extreme things to try to make a living. Some of them are panning for gold. As a result, they're being exposed to malaria, and as a result, malaria is spreading. That didn't happen before, as a result of that reason. Syria. We're all aware of the terrible crisis in Syria. But were you aware that there was huge migration that was taking place, urban migration in Syria, even before the crisis began, and that was already having profound societal impacts on Syria? Then, of course, just last week in the US, Hurricane Irma. One of the impacts was that 2 nuclear power plants had to be shut down because they were concerned of the impact that it might have. So I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about. Now, this is going to be a little bit difficult to see this slide. I'm going to use a pointer. But if you look here, there were just a few what we call mega cities in 1950. It was less than 1% of the total of the world population. But if you look projected into 2030, just about 10 years from now, there are dozens and dozens of megacities. And most of them reside right here in Asia. This is no surprise to you, mostly in China and, of course, India. Think of the implications, right? You're used to thinking about large numbers of people. You're used to thinking about the impact that it has on your cities and other things. But think about the world going forward and the mega cities that will be created in the next 70 years and what that's going to do to agricultural land, the rural landscape, etc. The world is interconnected in some very, very profound ways. Again, this is probably going to be a little bit difficult for you to see, but whether it's in the political, economic, societal, agricultural, climate, or other spheres, everything is connected to everything else. It's created what we like to call the wheel of misfortune, which means that no matter which topic we're talking about in these spheres, they're all having an impact on one another. Perhaps you thought about this before, but have you thought about how it impacts you, the places where you live, your country, and the region and world around you? The World Economic Forum this year asked executives from around the world what are some of their greatest concerns about doing business. And these are the top 10, ranging from unemployment and energy down to asset bubbles and interstate conflict. But I would suggest to you that probably for India, numbers 4 through 8 are the ones that are most profound because of social instability, terrorist attacks, critical infrastructure, and the state of infrastructure in this country, and what's trying to be done about it. What people think about India may not be what India thinks about itself. That's going to be an underlying theme of this discussion. Yet another slide that's going to be difficult to see, my apologies, but it basically looks at the global landscape and it compares impact versus likelihood. At the height is weather-related phenomenon and naturally occurring events, and at the bottom are things that are perhaps man-made risks. Now, depending on your frame of reference, this may or may not matter. We can't control the weather. We can control things like financial risks. But can we really control financial risks? Things are spinning so much out of control that it seems there's almost nothing we can control these days. The World Economic Forum also asked people from around the world the correlation that they found between these factors and whether they felt that their economies were struggling. The good news for India is that most Indians do not think their economy is struggling. But I ask you, one of India's greatest assets is its people, obviously. But in a country where half of the people are under age 25, and 2/3 of the people are under age 35. Is that a net plus or a net negative? It's a net plus if you can find all those folks jobs. But what do we do in a world where artificial intelligence and automation is taking over? What's going to happen with India's ability to create jobs when AI becomes dominant? Now it's emerging. What about when it becomes dominant? How will those jobs be met? How will those millions of new entrants into the workforce find work? I don't have an answer, by the way. But looking at the state of the world order, we're in such a transformational stage, so disruptive, shifting strategic relationships of every kind. Think about it. Turkey is a NATO member, right? But it just struck an arms deal with Russia. The Philippines has traditionally been a strong ally of the US, but it's making nice with China. So there are a variety of things that are helping to totally disrupt our understanding of the way foreign affairs works. Regional powers are pursuing supremacy. They're competing with one another like never before. International institutions are being upended as well. The United Nations isn't what it once was. The Asian Development Bank has competition from the Asia Infrastructure Bank. Everything is in a state of flux. Add to that mix failed or failing states. There's many of them in the world, and there's very little ability to do much about them. North Korea being a primary example. As the ambassador was saying earlier, and I'm going to touch on a number of things that she has already mentioned, this intersection between populism and nationalism has overtaken the landscape. And it has produced some very interesting political outcomes. For instance, Mr. Duterte in the Philippines. Aung San Suu Kyi, who has become somewhat of a surprise these days with the Rohingya and Rakhine State. And of course, there's Mr. Trump. Now, I know there are plenty of people who are in favor of Mr. Trump and plenty of people who don't particularly care for him. But one thing that he has definitely succeeded in doing is illustrated just how fractured America is politically, socially, economically, in so many other ways. Unfortunately, that fracturization is having an impact on the rest of the world. And the attempt, or lack of an effective attempt, to make effective foreign policy is having a profound effect on the rest of the world as well. I mean, I can't tell you from one day to another whether what he says is what his administration believes or what he will be saying tomorrow. How do you conduct foreign policy or domestic policy that way? We look at Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has plenty of fans and plenty of enemies as well. But one thing's for certain, that is, not only is he not going anywhere, but he's having a profound impact on the landscape as well. The alleged interference in the US election has certainly proven how relatively easy it is to do just what Russia is alleged to have done. And I'm going to touch on this in a few minutes in terms of how electronic interference and the internet is ruling the way not only all of us think, but the way the world works. Then there's the example of Brazil, right? A BRIC member also, showing great promise, and it just can't seem to get its act together. You know, a country with 200 million people, natural resource rich, with all the promise that you would think would automatically propel it to become a success story, has not proven to be the case. And then, of course, there's China. And China's an expert, as you know, at rewriting the rules. It goes right up to the line, then it takes a step back, it goes just past the line, takes a step back, and before you know it, there's a new line. That's going to be an ongoing challenge for India as well, of course. I'm a political risk analyst. So when I think of countries, I think about their potential attractiveness from an investment perspective. And I look at the variables that each of them have, and I try to say where are they different and where do they intersect. So in comparing China and India in these two cases, if I'm going to be concerned as an investor about what should be an issue for me, what are things in my control, what are things I cannot control, these are some of the things that come to mind. But that's part of the point, isn't it? Is that in the world that we're in today, it's not a given that investors are going to want to go necessarily anywhere. They have options. Looking at Indian foreign policy, I think India is to be commended for having taken such a realistic and flexible and foresightful approach to foreign policy. Not every country can say that. Vis-a-vis China, I think it's admirable that India has said they don't particularly care for the One Belt, One Road policy. To my knowledge, no other country in the world has said that. India's non-aligned movement historically, that's one reason why it's able to do that. But it's honest with itself, which I think is a huge plus. It's true to itself. And it's rolling with the punches. It's creating new ways of reaching out to other nations. I think it's admirable, and I think it's become a new model for what other nations around the world should be doing. Shifting onto the economic front. Since Mr. Modi came in power, as you can see here, the pillars of Indian competitiveness have become much, much better. In fact, profoundly better. Whether it's in the infrastructure, macroeconomic, labor market, whatever you may think about, it's been dramatic improvement. And I think India should be commended for that. And the investment community around the world, of course, knows this and recognizes this. Now that said, if we look at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, out of 138 countries, India comes in at 39. So not bad, but for the most, well, almost the most populous country in the world, soon to be the most populous country in another few years, I would have expected a little bit better. Now, admittedly, these are somewhat subjective, and I'm sure there are things they're not taking into account, but if you look here, India's in the middle range for most of these indices, and it can certainly do better. The forum also asked people in the business communities around the world what they thought of investing in India and what are some of the biggest impediments to doing business here. And the things that were among the least concern were things like access to financing and the educated nature of the workforce. The things that were the most concern related to taxes and corruption. Those should be within the government's, the business community's control. But let's put that in perspective. The World Bank Doing Business rankings, out of 190 countries, India ranks 130. The interesting thing about this chart is that of the 10 factors that doingbusiness.org rates on behalf of the World Bank, many of the factors that India has here are in the lowest third percentile. Certainly, India can do better. In terms of the size of the Indian economy vis-à-vis the rest of the world in GDP, it's just under 3%. Roughly the same as Brazil, roughly the same as Italy. You might have expected it to be somewhat larger, but there's good news. And the good news is that as of 2014, India was ranked 9th in the world in terms of nominal GDP, but it's projected by the EIU that by 2050, India will be number 3. That accelerated growth rate that the ambassador was talking about, it's going to get on fire from here, according to the EIU, and there's every reason to believe that it will. So the question becomes, what will India do with that? That revenue that's generated as a result of that growth, how is it going to be spent? What kind of transformational things that need to be done are going to be done? And what happens after the Modi government has served its term? Who knows what comes next? Looking at the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which ranges about a dozen factors, India comes in just below average. It's about the same as many of the other BRICS and other sized economies, other emerging economies, other strong economies. So in terms of economic freedom, it can certainly do better. The Corruption Perceptions Index from Transparency International, as of 2016, again, on a par, roughly, with its BRIC brethren and others in the world. Not the worst, and not the best. Another area where it can do better. And in terms of terrorism and political violence, I don't need to tell you where you stand on that scale. It's a very difficult situation here, and the authorities are doing a tremendous job in trying to thwart it. I can just tell you from my own experience with airport security, both coming into Delhi and flying today from Delhi here, I feel safer here than I do in the US, I must say. I was asked to recheck a number of things that I wasn't asked to check in the US. So it's a difficult issue, but it's getting better. That said, if we look at how India ranks vis-a-vis the rest of the world in terms of these variables, these 9 variables, ranging from monetary policy to social stability to the legal system to transparency, it falls below average, below the world average in all of these rankings. So I thought this was interesting also. I took a look at 45 years of history of terrorism based on severity, based on injuries around the world. Very few countries are not impacted by terrorism, of course. India is not in the hottest of the hot zones. Of course, that's reserved for places like the Middle East and northeastern Nigeria and the southern Philippines. But of course, you've had a lot of history with terrorism, and it's a very, very difficult thing to address. The Naxalites, Most of the world, most of the investors who come here, they have no idea what the Naxalites are. I remember when I was working for a large multinational, I was asked to give a view on Indian competitiveness as a place to invest, etc. And I started talking about the Naxalites, and these very experienced business people had virtually no idea what I was talking about. Of course, all of you do. Yes, it's a big problem. In fact, those same people who produced that index, they show that since 2007, there's been a 5-fold increase in incidents in terrorism in India. I don't know if you consider it such. It's a daily reality in many places in the country, but I thought that was a very alarming statistic. And the types of terrorism seem to have gone up for so many different areas, whether it's business or tourism or against government targets itself. So in terms of investment climate, in terms of something that potential investors look at, that's certainly a consideration. But I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about something called virtual terrorism. This is the subject of a book that I released just last month, in fact, called Virtual Terror. And virtual terrorism is about terrorism via the internet and remote control. And I've created a new definition which basically says that it doesn't matter whether it's an individual, a business, a group, or a government that is engaged in that terrorism. If you're on the receiving end of that, it doesn't much matter, because there's stealing and snooping and harm that comes with it. And that is a growing area of concern for all governments and all individuals everywhere. Part of the reason for that is that social media feeds virtual terrorism. All of us are glued to our smartphones, our laptops, etc. I imagine most everyone in this room is a participant in social media. Well, I became surprisingly educated on just how vulnerable each of us are every time we log in. Every time we go on social media, etc. We're being watched all the time. Our risk of being hacked is ever present, not just as individuals, but as businesses and as governments. This is helping transform the landscape before our eyes, and it's going to become the norm with time. It's coming close to that already. Financial services suffers greatly. That's part of the reason they spend billions of dollars every year trying to fight it. I note that one bank in particular had almost 2 billion attempts at hacking in a single month. 2 billion with a B. I couldn't believe it. In fact, it's so interesting because these hackers are so sophisticated that they can go into your account and you will not even know they've been there. And they can switch money in and out of it, and they monitor and adjust your account real time so that you can go in and the amount of money that you think you have in your account says exactly what it is, but there's all this other stuff going on behind the scene. Huge challenge for banks. And then there's biometrics. I know Aadhaar is a subject of some debate in this country vis-a-vis privacy, vis-a-vis fighting fraud and helping people get the entitlements that they should receive. I would simply say to you that in 2011, Israel had its entire national biometric database stolen. It was much different than yours. As I understand it, your database has fingerprints, irises, and a number that goes with it. In Israel's case, their social security numbers, their medical histories, all these various things were also hacked. The problem is that we might get excited about the new iPhone being able to recognize our faces and we don't have to push the home button. In fact, there is no home button anymore. But there's a problem with that as far as I'm concerned. That problem is that once your face has been released into the internet, once your fingerprints are released into the internet, you don't get them back, and you can't change them. So if it were me, you may wish to follow this suggestion, you may not. I'm not going to get the new iPhone. I prefer my numbers and letters. I'm very happy with them. Then, of course, there's the threat of bioterrorism, ever present. Think about drones and how potentially bioterrorist type of activity can be conducted by drones. That's one of the byproducts of drones that we don't even think about these days. Apart from the snooping element, it actually would be a pretty good way to disperse chemical agents. That's a problem for everybody around the world. And now I want to switch a little bit to climate change, something everyone is familiar with, particularly here. There are dozens of cyclones every year, etc. Interesting to note that since 1980, there's been a threefold increase worldwide in weather catastrophes. And of course, we're becoming very aware of that in the US after this very active cyclone season, after 10 plus years of not having any in the US. We're really paying for it now. But the fact that these extreme weather events have tripled in a very short period of time should be a concern to all of us, regardless of which side you are on the climate change debate. The most dangerous countries for natural disasters, well, I don't need to tell you, India scores pretty well there. It's not the worst, it's certainly not the best, but a government's ability to manage it ultimately will help distinguish it from the many other countries that are exposed in this area. Lloyd's produced a paper last year called the City Risk Index, and they identified a dozen or so indices that impact just how profound cities can be impacted from man-made and natural risks. I don't know if you can read this, but at the bottom it says market crashes, which could account for a quarter of the losses of all cities in the world. What I think is more interesting is the climate change component in terms of earthquakes, windstorms, and other elements, which could account for the majority of the losses for cities. How might this impact India? Well, if we look, this is produced by the OECD, if we look by assets at risk from sea rise levels rising as they have been going forward into 2070, there are two Indian cities which figure prominently, Kolkata and Mumbai, in the top 6. That's by assets at risk. But if we look at population at risk, it's a different story. Kolkata and Mumbai are the tops. And of the entire top 10 cities that the OECD projects, 9 of the 10 are in Asia. Now, we have no way of knowing whether any of this is going to come true or not. But what's worth thinking about is that every coastal city is potentially at huge risk, and a large percentage of those are financial centers. Imagine what would happen if the Mumbais and the New Yorks of the world were underwater. Another thing that not everyone thinks about vis-a-vis climate change is the impact on human health and how it can have some unpredictable impacts, not just respiratory issues and asthma, but things like malaria, malnutrition, heart-related illnesses. Again, it's all interconnected. Tropical diseases are on the move. We got introduced to Zika in the US last year. We're not used to thinking of ourselves as a tropical country. That's because we're not. But I think the point is that tropical diseases, airborne diseases, they don't know any boundaries. They're spreading just like everything else. So what I'm saying here in short is that the lens that we look through and the lens that other people look through at us is rather important. It's very unlikely that your own view of India as a country, as an investment destination, is the view of others. So I think it's very important to take many of the things I've been talking about here into consideration in thinking about not only what India might be able to do to become an even more desirable investment destination, but also in terms of your companies, the way you do business around the world, how you think about alternative investment destinations, and how some of these things impact it. What I would suggest is that rather than thinking about your businesses as an episode of rollerball, where you're just going to elbow someone out of the way, and you're just going to devour whoever might be in your path, think about the way this guy looks at the world. He knows there's something out there. He knows there's obstacles in the way, and he's prepared for them. That's what I suggest that both your businesses and India do, even more than it's doing. Ultimately, any country's ability to innovate, to turn good ideas into something transformational, is going to make the difference in this hyper-competitive world that we live in. Certainly, India is very well poised to be able to do that, not only with your manpower, but you're already such leaders in technology and engineering and science and so many other areas. If you can find a way to harness that into this century, taking into account the things that I've been talking about, I think that's part of the answer. In closing, I would say India has every reason to be proud of where it is and where it's going. I'm optimistic about India's future. And I think with a little bit of wind at your back, hopefully not too strongly, and with some transformational thinking and turning the pyramid upside down, there's every reason to believe that India will be the economic and political powerhouse of the next century. Thank you.